Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, March 1st. Last weekend was the second anniversary of Russia's full-on attack on Ukraine, and indeed the 10th anniversary of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. So this week, we will devote the entire program to looking back at what has happened over the past 2 years and where we think this conflict is going. On the battlefield, Russia is on the offensive across the entire 600-mile frontier, and Ukrainians who are outmanned and outgunned are beginning to feel the strains of a war that has left tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and left millions fleeing the country. Meanwhile, there is a growing debate within the West on how best to proceed. French President Emmanuel Macron opened up a Pandora's box on Monday when he said that he would not rule out the possibility of sending ground troops to Ukraine, leading to very quick denials from Berlin, Washington, and other NATO capitals, and an explicit threat to use nuclear weapons by Vladimir Putin yesterday. And finally, in Washington, internal Republican fissures are holding up desperately needed military aid to Ukraine, while the issue of Ukraine and indeed Russia itself are becoming increasingly embroiled in presidential election politics. So here to talk about all of these parts of this important set of issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Catherine Philp is diplomatic correspondent for the Times of London. Anton La Guardia is diplomatic editor at The Economist, and Yaroslav Trofimov is chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and author of a terrific new book, Our Enemies Will Vanish. All three, wonderful to have you here back on the show. Terrific to see you. You've all reported on Ukraine, in Ukraine, and around it for the past 2+ years, in some cases longer than that. So I thought let's spend some time talking about this in some detail. And Yaroslav, let's start with you and sort of help us understand what's happening on the battlefield and how is that reverberating into the politics that of course is part of the process in Ukraine itself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm great to be on the show. I guess the biggest ingredient on the battlefield, the biggest determinant factor of battlefield dynamics is ammunition, especially artillery ammunition, especially ammunition for 155 millimeter artillery that is the mainstay of Ukrainian forces since it was supplied by Western howitzers about 3 or 4 months into the war. And here the dynamics clearly favor Russia now. If in August, September, Ukraine had an advantage in artillery shells, small but still an advantage, in part because of a supply of South Korean ammunition, about 300,000 shells from South Korea, and American resources and European shells. Now it's changed. Now the Russians have an advantage of as much as 10-1. So for every shell the Ukrainians fire, they get 10 in exchange in return from the Russians. And that's because American aid has dried up. It's been more than 4 months. That the House has been sitting on the administration's proposal to resupply Ukraine with weapons. That's because the Europeans have failed to meet their goal of 1 million shells last year, supplied only about a third of that. And that's because the Russians have ramped up their industries, manufacturing much more than before, but also because they've been receiving more than 1 million shells from North Korea that really changed the dynamics of the battlefield. So, and we see the results of that. So for the first time since May last year, Ukraine lost the city of Avdiivka near Donetsk. It was not a catastrophic loss because the Ukrainian military managed to pull back in an organized fashion without having large numbers of troops surrounded, cut off, killed. And so they preserved the fighting units in part by sending one of the best forces, the 3rd Assault Brigade, that really opened up the exits from Avdiivka and allowed this retreat. But the Russians keep pressing. They've been taking new villages in the last few days, and the front line there has not stabilized yet. It has been sort of stable elsewhere. So in the other directions where Russia is trying to attack, so far they haven't had any major successes. But clearly the initiative now is with the Russians because they do have more ammunition. And that's, it's in part offset by the use of drones, FPV drones, which is the new wonder weapon in the war, sort of this cheap, $300-$400 drones that can target with precision an enemy tank or a group of troops or other fighting vehicle. But that's not enough. And so the fate of Ukraine really does depend on this ingredient, how many more shells will be coming.
So it's just it's an artillery fight that we're seeing. It's a war of attrition, and basically who has more manpower and more artillery shells is going to be able to defend better, because it really is two defensive going against each other. Talk a little bit about the manpower issue that seems to be also part of this equation.
Right. Well, there are three elements to this. So the ammunition is the immediate one. It determines what's happening right now. In the war of attrition, overall, the trend is favorable to Ukraine because it's destroying many more Russian tanks and fighting vehicles than Russia is able to manufacture or repair. So, if you talk to military analysts, they will tell that in 2 years or so, they will basically run out of tanks. And it's unlike ammunition, and there is no ready source for Russia to get them from elsewhere. There's no stock of thousands of tanks sitting somewhere that somebody will give to Russia. Manpower, Ukraine has had losses. President Zelensky announced for the first time an official number in recent days, 31,000. That does not include people who are officially missing in action. And that means that, there can be many more tens of thousands whose bodies have remained in Russian-controlled areas and are not accounted as officially dead. So there have been extrapolations made based on monuments in some Ukrainian towns. People counted how many names are in these monuments and extrapolated to the population at large and came up with something like 70,000, 80,000 killed soldiers so far in the war. It's a very rough estimate, but, military analysts think it's probably correct. Ukraine has had issues with mobilization, but, it is mobilizing people all the time. Russia also has issues with manpower. And so far, it hasn't gone for the second wave of mobilization to follow through on one that dragged about 300,000 reservists into Ukraine in September, October 2022. But that may happen after the presidential elections in Russia.
Catherine, you've reported off and on from Kyiv and other places in Ukraine. Talk a little bit about, when you talk to your sources and the last time you were there, what the mood is in the cities. And how that is affecting sort of the views of the leadership. There's been a debate, of course, a change in military leadership, slight decline in Zelensky's popularity. Not, any Western leader would love to have the popularity he has, but it's not as great as it used to be. Talk a little bit about the what you see happening within the politics and the society writ large as people are looking for a third and a long time war of attrition here.
Yeah, well, excuse me, I'm actually going back to Ukraine on Monday, so I'll have an updated view on that. But I think it's safe to say that clearly some of the enthusiasm and energy and defiance that characterized Ukraine's initial response to the invasion has worn off as the country enters its third year of war and the prospect of a very long and very punishing conflict. Obviously there has been tension over what the West has and has not provided. I think it's been now more than 6 months since there was an agreement to send F-16 fighter jets, and that hasn't happened yet. So I think there's a fear in Ukraine that some of that stuff is never going to come. I think Yaro just alluded to some of the issues over mobilization. There had been previously an order of mobilization where people over 27 could get called up, and that's now dropped down to 25. There's definitely an increased number of people attempting to dodge that draft because unlike the earlier part of the war, it's much clearer, I think, to Ukrainians what they're facing, what they might face if they are mobilized and they go to the front. The numbers of dead that Yaro mentioned there much higher than the official figures, and I think the outcome is the eventual outcome is less clear than it's ever been, and so there is a mood of amongst many people of, would they simply be throwing their lives away into the meat grinder of this, the trench warfare at the front, without even the prospect of a fully liberated Ukraine at the end of it.
Anton, you're looking at what the Russians are, and your sense of how the Russians are looking at this. We had this speech yesterday by Vladimir Putin. He's been talking more and more about the war. The special military operation, as they euphemistically call a large-scale invasion of another country. But you do have the sense that, on the one hand, the Russians are getting more comfortable and more confident about what's happening. And yet, on the other hand, they also know there's some real strains on the system, which they don't talk about. But Yaroslav mentioned manpower issues, production issues. Yes, it's better than nothing, but it's not going as well as it could. And they're getting Soviet era World War II tanks out of storage and trying to repair them to bring them to the front. How do you see where the Russians are looking at this 2 years in the war, and how they look at where they are today and where they may come tomorrow?
I think they feel that they have the wind in their sails. They are advancing slowly, painfully, and bloodily. They have the advantage in terms of production over not only over Ukraine, but over the West in general at the moment. There are strains evident. You saw, a reasonably large number of people come out for Alexei Navalny's funeral this morning. And, a large share of the Russian budget is going towards defense spending, which means it can't be spent on the population and so on. The unknown question, to which Yaroslav probably has a better answer, is how much strain can Russian society take before it turns against the leadership? And, there have been instances. You saw, for example, the very short-lived rebellion by Prigozhin's Wagner group, which was, snuffed out very quickly, and then he himself appears to have been killed in a plane accident, or his plane was shot down rather. So I think he feels confident domestically. An election is coming up in Russia. I think he's going to win it comfortably in the way that Russian leaders do win elections, because they stack up all the dice in their favor. But the place is increasingly repressive and increasingly difficult to express dissent. You've got a small group of mothers of soldiers who are saying, bring our soldiers back. But I don't think, at least sitting from here, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference.
Yaroslav, how do you see it? I mean, the British Ministry of Defense put out a statement: 350,000 killed and wounded. That's a large number. The Soviet Union lost, at least officially, about 15,000 people in 10 years in fighting in Afghanistan, which led to pretty strong protests. How do you see the stability of the society? And as Anton rightly mentioned, a lot of people out on the street defying the idea that they may be arrested in order to express their feelings about the death of the murder, I think, of Alexei Navalny.
Yeah, well, I agree with Anton that Putin certainly thinks that the wind is in his sails. But I would also say that he's probably underestimating the tension within the society. And Russia, as the U.S. intelligence community likes to say, is hard but brittle. And we did see these cracks with Prigozhin. And, you mentioned 15,000 people that were killed in Afghanistan over 10 years of war there. Let's look at Avdiivka. Avdiivka is a town of 30,000 people before the war, maybe 300 people by the time the Russians took the ruins of it. And, there was a Russian soldier, a blogger, a quite famous figure in this whole so-called Russian Spring movement, Andrei Morozov, who wrote after the fall of Avdiivka that 16,000 Russian soldiers were killed in that battle. And then he committed suicide, or allegedly committed suicide, after the outcry from all the propagandists yelling at him for releasing state secrets. So that's the cost of the Russian war, 16,000 people for a small town. So if the Ukrainian resistance continues, Ukraine doesn't collapse for internal reasons, or if the Russians don't suddenly become much more proficient on the battlefield, it's hard to see that the Russian military and society can continue bearing this kind of costs. It's not just 1,600 people, it was also several hundred tanks and fighting vehicles that were lost in Avdiivka.
Right.
There was visual evidence of, I think, more than 400.
So I think 16,000 killed in Avdiivka, and the reporting was 30,000 killed for Bakhmut. So you're at about 50,000 soldiers killed for the two major, and I'll put that in quotation marks, Russian victories on the front line. If that's what it costs to move forward, I think that.
And these two towns had a combined pre-war population of 100,000 people.
Right.
100.
And I think we forget the incredible cost that this war is exacting on everyone who's fighting, but particularly on the Russians. And it does have an impact, one would expect, at some point on society. The question is, who collapses first? And Catherine, maybe that's a good segue to what's happening in Europe. Some of us were in Munich at the security conference earlier a few weeks ago, which really saw a European anxiety on the one hand about what's happening with regard to Putin and Russia and Ukraine, and then on the other hand, what was happening in the United States. But I also thought, interestingly enough, a determination to say, no, we're not going to let this happen. We're going to do what we need to do. And then, as part of that, over the weekend, I guess Monday, just last Monday, the French President Macron got a bunch of European leaders together to talk about what to do, and then threw that bombshell of, well, maybe we should just send troops. So tell us what's happening. What's the mood in Europe, and what is the sort of the consequence of another Macronism, because they're becoming the norm.
Yeah, I mean, I think apart from it being a Macronism, we have to put this in the context of, I think, a subject that Anton is going to guide us through in more detail to come, which is, I think, that Europe is feeling the pressure of the fact that the US may no longer be a reliable partner when it comes to European security. And obviously this is twofold. This is partly because of the congressional battles over the funding for Ukraine. It's also about frankly, the distraction that the Israeli war against Hamas is having. And thirdly, the specter that is looming over an entire year of geopolitics and already changing it, which is the prospect of a Trump presidency. And I think that he's not even the presumptive candidate yet, but it's already having an outsized effect on geopolitics. And so I think that what Macron said when he blurted out that they might send NATO troops was possibly he was trying to signal a huge European commitment to the cause of Ukraine, to the fact that, that he wants to signal to Putin, no, we're not going to stand back. But obviously there are fissures within Europe over what happens with Ukraine. I mean, we've seen that over the most recent NATO expansion. We've seen the sort of tepid response Hungary, in particular, has given to some of the European proposals for supporting Ukraine. I think that this dimension, excuse me, of the Ukraine conflict about the European support is something that is bigger than just Ukraine, and that is going to be a really big issue for Europe to grapple with. We're not just talking about can Europe potentially make up the money should the US defund Ukraine, essentially? We're talking about the possibility of rethinking the entire European security architecture with the prospect or the possibility of a Trump presidency that wouldn't necessarily do something as dramatic as withdraw from NATO, because that is not easy to do, and I think that it requires a vast majority in Congress, and I think a lot of European leaders have been a little bit complacent about that possibility because it is so difficult, and the idea that it can't just be about one man. Excuse me, but it doesn't need to be that grave. It needs to. It only needs for a President Trump to not respond to an Article 5 call of an attack on one is an attack on all. So I think that it's very critical to see European support for Ukraine in that context of a very live, ongoing process of Europe having to wake up to the fact that it has never done enough on its own to secure the continent's security, and that things may look very different in the future.
Anton, I think Catherine paints the picture well of how the Europeans are feeling that, frankly, for the first time since World War II, they are coming to realize that maybe they need to take care of their own security and can no longer rely on the United States. But then internally, there seems to be also a question of how much, if that's what everyone agrees we need to move towards, but the time frame doesn't allow you to do that in weeks, it takes years to do that. There is this other debate that's going on about how much risk do you want to take, in order to maintain and save save Ukraine. If you talk about two different poles, one represented by Germany, which is we will help Ukraine, but not so much that risks escalation with war. So the Germans have refused to send long-range missiles, and the others, the French and the Brits, I would argue, and perhaps the East Europeans saying, no, we need to do everything we possibly could, short of direct military engagement, and even that now is put on the table by Macron. Is there a big debate going on, you think, in Europe about how much risk to take, and how does Vladimir Putin's decision yesterday to put nuclear weapons centrally on the table to, quote, defend Russian territory, which of course to him includes big chunks of Ukraine, part of that equation, and how's that going to change things?
Well, the Europeans are caught between an aggressive Putin who is rattling nuclear weapons at regular intervals, and the growing disenchantment of the United States with protecting Europe. So they're caught between Putin and Trump, as Catherine said. And there are multiple risks. One is also the fact that most European arsenals are now highly depleted, and there's not much left to send. If I'm not mistaken, the Danes just announced that they would send all of their artillery. Whatever they have left, they're going to send. Other countries feel they have contingencies elsewhere they have to worry about, so they're not going to send quite everything. But the reality is that the depth of the magazines and the arsenals in Europe is much shallower than in the United States. The problem in the United States is that money is short because Congress won't appropriate it. The other questions then for the Europeans, so what do we do if the United States withdraws partially or entirely from NATO, which is now no longer inconceivable? How do we organize ourselves? There is a kind of embryonic European security dimension, but it's far too feeble to take over such a big responsibility, although it has a role to play in the defense industrial base. The bigger question is, can the Europeans take over NATO? Can they take over more of NATO in the absence of U.S. support, of U.S. forces, of U.S. enablers, and most importantly, U.S. leadership? America is the hegemon. It is the organizing force behind what remains, which is a collection of small and medium-sized states that would find it very difficult to bow before the wishes of any one particular power. So how do you provide leadership? And the last thing to think about is who provides nuclear deterrence. The French and the Brits have nuclear weapons, but a fairly small and limited number, intended mainly for national use, but both of which have some kind of European or NATO dimension. But no one's ever really thought about whether the 400, 500 odd nuclear weapons in the hands of the Europeans would be sufficient to deter the 6,000 odd warheads that the Russians hold.
Complicated issues, Yaroslav, and I think that dimension sort of plays into the debate that really is being had not only in Europe, but I think also in Ukraine on the question of how much the West needs to provide and what kind of capabilities. Catherine mentioned F-16s. There's big debate in Germany on Taurus missiles, which is a longer-range cruise missile. A big debate in the United States on providing ATACMS, a longer-range ground rocket missile that is there. And this belief that there is a debate between those who think if you provide those capabilities, you can actually allow Ukraine to regain part, if not all, of the territory that it has by holding at risk the things and destroying things that Russia values. And on the other hand, the risk that might lead to the kind of actions on the nuclear front that Vladimir Putin talked about yesterday. How do you look at that, and how should we look at this debate? Because it's becoming, it goes in cycles. We've had this, but it's really becoming a bigger one now, particularly since the Europeans are saying the only thing we have is stuff that the Ukrainians really want, air power and long-range missiles. But it's also the one thing that we're worried about if we give it to them, that it will lead to a wider conflagration.
Yeah, so I think the air power will probably come this year, the F-16. I mean, Ukrainian pilots are being trained, and it's at some point this year it will come. And but I think let's look at the broader framework. The paradox about this war was that Russia is able to target anything in Ukraine with its longer-range weapons, and all the weapons given by the U.S. and its allies so far in this war came with the provision you're not allowed to use them on Russian territory. So the city of Kharkiv is being pummeled by Russian artillery and rockets, and the Ukrainians are unable to use even American howitzers to shoot at Russian artillery positions just across the border. So it's this entire war has been fought with one hand tied behind Ukraine's back because of Western fears of provoking Russia. And obviously, as Anton said, Putin has been floating out this nuclear menace every few months. He tried to use it back in September 2022 to prevent Ukraine from seizing the city of Kherson. He said it's Russian territory. We will use all our means at our disposal to stop you. And the Ukrainians just called his bluff and went in. So if you talk to Ukrainian commanders, they will tell you that the war in Ukraine cannot be won just in Ukraine. We have seen successfully how Ukraine established deterrence in the maritime domain by attacking Russian ports. The Russians, canceled the Green Deal, announced they're blockading the port of Odessa, the main source of Ukrainian exports, and then the Ukrainian forces targeted Russian naval assets, including a tanker used by the Russian military. Some of its assets were targeted in Novorossiysk, Russia's main oil port. And once Russia understood that it could lose the ability to use Novorossiysk, its main outlet for exports of oil, then all of a sudden deterrence was established, and Ukraine was able to reopen Odessa, which is now, I think, exporting more goods than it used to before the war began. And so what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to establish the same sort of deterrence when it comes to Russian missile strikes and other, drone strikes. And so far, they're not able to use any of the Western weapons. They, when they do target, military bases, fuel facilities, industrial facilities in Russia, they can only do it with their own homemade drones, which is obviously not enough so far to deter Russia. But, as Ukrainian commanders, as the previous commander of Ukrainian forces, General Zaluzhny wrote in an article in September 2022, even if we liberate all of Ukraine, the Russian domination in the long-range fight will still mean that the war will not be over. And he's correct, because the war will not be over as long as Russia is able to fire missiles at Kiev or Lviv or Odessa, and Ukraine is not able to do the same to Russian cities.
Yeah, no, I think that's the political dimension. I think we haven't talked about negotiations. We haven't talked about peace. One of the reasons is hard to see how this war ends, even if the territorial issue gets quote resolved, because it's a war about politics, not necessarily about territory. So I think that's certainly true as you talk about it. But it's a devilishly complicated issue for when you're sitting in the Oval Office or in the Berlin Chancellery to say, do we really want to go risk the possibility of a direct confrontation with Russia, and yet what do we need to do for Ukraine to be able to win? That has changed over time. The question is, will it continue to change? Maybe to the extent it has, it's always a little. It'll come, but a little too late to have a real difference.
But I think there's also like a big shift in understanding in the last a few months in Europe, especially in France. There is an understanding that the war in Ukraine is not about Ukraine, and that it's very likely that if Russia manages to come to Kiev again, it will not stop there. And that, I think, what explains Macron's decision to open the issue of troops, because I don't think he's talking about sending troops now, but what the French, the Poles, maybe the Scandinavians are talking about is that if the situation is catastrophic, to prevent the collapse of the Ukrainian state, that could be an option.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think what struck me in Munich was this understanding by the Europeans that basically the West Europeans finally understanding what the East Europeans had been saying for a very long time, that what's happening in Russia affects all of them. Radek Sikorsky said 15 years ago, we told them they were coming and you didn't believe us. 10 years ago, we told them you were coming and you didn't believe us. 5 years ago, we told you they were coming and believe us. Now, please believe us. And Radek Sikorsky, foreign minister of Poland for the second time around, can put it in those terms extraordinarily well. I think people now believe it. And Anton, that maybe is a good way to switch, because it seems to me while the debate in Europe is fundamentally at how do we make sure that Europe remains secure by ensuring that Russia does not win, that's not the debate in the United States. In fact, this idea that what happens in Ukraine can be separated from what happens in Europe is in some ways still part of the debate, and a larger debate about should we even care what happens in Europe. J.D. Vance senator from Ohio, was in Munich making the case that this is a lost cause and why should we even help them? The Europeans can do it by themselves and we should be worried about China. So bring us up to date about what is happening in terms of the U.S. debate, not just on Capitol Hill on funding. A bill has been on the books since September, I believe, is the first time that a request for additional funding. So that's 6 months now. But also sort of this larger debate about how do we think about Ukraine and Europe and the relationship between them, and should we care?
Well, I think there are basically three schools of thought. And there's one is that what happens in Ukraine matters across the world and matters to America's position in the world. And what Putin is doing in Ukraine is being watched avidly by Xi Jinping in Asia in the context of Taiwan. And you see a binding together of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. North Korea and Iran supplying weapons to Russia, for example. And in turn, perhaps Russia supplying technology to North Korea and possibly to Iran. So, there are sort of call them globalists, internationalists who see everything as connected together, and therefore it is important that Russia should not win in Ukraine because it affects America's position everywhere else. You've got, let's call them restrainers or isolationists, who think America can no longer be the global policeman and therefore should start to wind down its commitments around the world. It's got plenty of problems at home, especially the border with Mexico. Why are we caring about the borders of Ukraine when we have problems in the border in the United States? And then you have maybe what you would call the prioritizers. And this is a sort of three-part taxonomy that the European Council on Foreign Relations came up with, who accept that America no longer is a unipolar power, but is still extremely powerful, still has global interests, but those interests lie in Asia. And therefore, the US should be winding down in Europe and the Middle East in order to concentrate everything in Asia. The problem is that the wars that have broken out are in Europe and now in the Middle East. And, America has found it very difficult to say we have no interest, or at least the Biden administration has found that difficult. In the Republican Party, views are divided, as opinion polls from your own institute are showing, that people who are strongly in favor of Trump have a very different outlook on the world, more isolationist, more sort of retrenching than the rest of the party does. And I think you're seeing tensions played out within the party. So this supplemental bill, if it were brought to the floor of the House, I mean, firstly, it passed the Senate after much gnashing of teeth. Were it brought to the House, it would probably be voted through. The trouble is that the Republicans have a very small majority in the House, and it's a majority that is smaller than the number of sort of hardline Make America Great Again devotees who are adamantly opposed to supporting Ukraine further. So the people who oppose Ukraine are those who say, let's do less in the world, or the people who say, let's do more in Asia. But I think the center of gravity of the party, were it able to express itself, would be in favor of continuing to help Ukraine, but maybe perhaps doing less on civilian aid, doing less on humanitarian stuff, and focusing it entirely on the military side, where the US still provides more than the rest of the Europeans combined, although in global terms, the Europeans have blatantly taken up more of the slack. So, it is a difficult moment. As Catherine says, you're feeling the shadow of Donald Trump, and you're really seeing for the first time America's role in the world open to question.
And I think open to real debate, Anton, as you rightly put it, between these three schools, which in terms of Ukraine, the second and the first and the third sort of coalesce to say, let's not do Ukraine, let's worry about either Asia or, frankly, nothing. Yaroslav, do the Ukrainians see this as basically the new reality? They no longer believe, or do they still believe that there will be ultimately a majority and that they can count on the United States? Or and how do the Russians look at this? And how does that affect their conduct as they proceed in the war?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the Ukrainians, they have to plan for all contingencies, and it's very likely that the supplemental will never be passed. And it is a problem. It is a problem, especially this year, because you have this issue that the Europeans are increasing the ammunition production, and they will be able to make up for the American stocks, but not now, next year. So we're now in this critical month, several months, when the American ammunition stocks are irreplaceable. And so that's why this delay is so painful for the Ukrainians. But, what can they do? I mean, they have to keep fighting. It's not they're going to surrender. It's not like there's an option of peace on the table. So they will make do with what they can. For a defensive war, 2,000 to 3,000 shells a day is probably sufficient. Europeans said they will provide 1 million shells this year. Let's see if they can do it. But obviously, the investment in the production in Europe is much bigger than the U.S. and it is rising fast, especially in Germany. What will a Trump administration bring? If Trump is reelected, he did call Zelensky a good man and a great salesman the other day. He did say that he has a formula for peace that he wouldn't reveal. But obviously, there is great concern that he would pull the plug one way or another on aid to Ukraine. Russia, the Russians are hoping that Trump wins, very clearly. Not just because they think that, he would give them a better deal, which he may or may not. The first Trump administration actually was the first administration that did provide weapons to Ukraine, something that Obama had refused to do. But I think the Russians are also counting on, discord inside the United States, rendering the U.S. more and more dysfunctional in case of Trump victory, and therefore making the Russian job for the Russians much easier.
Interesting that Trump is taking a page out of the Nixon, another page out of the Nixon playbook by promising peace in our peace, a secret plan for peace. In that case, it was Vietnam in 1969. Now it's for Ukraine. But then he's taken many other pages out of that playbook as well before. Catherine, just to come to you, what's striking, it seems to me, in the debate that is happening in Europe is the voices that were there to say we need to figure out a way to negotiate a peace agreement, to get to peace, to get to a negotiation. They're pretty silent. I mean, even in Germany, which and the German chancellor, who is often suspected of wanting that, that's not the rhetoric that is coming from Berlin. Is there a sense that this is not the time, or this is not the way, or we can't get there, or how do people think about the prospect for negotiation now?
I mean, I think, excuse me, proximity is a great clarifier, and the fact that Europe abuts Russia focuses the mind more possibly than in America. I think that the number one reason why this isn't being discussed more, given the situation, is the fact that no one could be certain that negotiations, anything that would come out of a negotiation would stick. I mean, who's going to take Vladimir Putin's word for anything? What does an agreement even mean? So you can go through that process. You can arrive at some kind of settlement, even put Ukraine in the position where it feels it has to give up much of the territory that it is not in control of right now. But where does that end? And I mean, it's interesting what you said about Eastern Europe and all the warnings they've given over decades to Western Europe and to the US about the threat that Russia poses. I've never been someone who, in the past, believed that that Russia would attack a NATO member state. I don't think we have that confidence anymore. I don't think we can be, we can rule that out anymore. And I mean, again, we've heard, I mean, yes, Putin has been rattling the nuclear saber since the outset of the invasion. But we've had some revelations recently. For example, this week, the Financial Times came out with a marmalade dropper, as we call it, on this side of the pond, about the circumstances in which Russia would be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. And the threshold was much, much lower, even though that, in fact, what these documents were revealing was a war game over China. It remains the same, that there is a preparedness potentially for Russia to use battlefield nuclear weapons. So I think it's not impossible to foresee a situation in which President Trump, should he become president again, doesn't withdraw from NATO, but makes it so manifestly clear that he would not honor an Article 5 call, that you could see something like Russia decide that it's going to walk 10 miles into Finland and dare NATO to do anything about it, with the warning, we will use tactical nuclear weapons if you try to drive us back. I mean, these are considerations, I think, that once sounded utterly fanciful and were the stuff of Hollywood, and they no longer are.
No, I think for some of us in our age, that this gets you back to the 70s and the 60s, and of course the 50s, when we did worry about those kinds of scenarios constantly. Anton, final point to you, because I think Catherine rightly raises the story in the Financial Times about the nuclear threshold. We also had a debate here in the United States, a big one, over the prospect of intelligence suggesting that the Russians might be interested in putting a nuclear weapon in space. in order to take out our satellites, on which we depend a lot more than the Russians do. And our, just how has that played into this larger debate in the United States that you talked about how much should we worry about Russia, and how much should we stand up to them now before it gets too costly and too difficult to do it later?
The kind of nuclear debate has been around since the start of the war, and you see it in President Joe Biden's actions, where he, wants to support Ukraine, but is always worried about not going too far, lest it provokes escalation. And yet, as the war has gone on, he's been willing to provide more and more advanced weapons and capable weapons, not least including some medium-range missiles. But the worry of escalation is always there, and not least because even without the recent revelations of the documents, there's been a sense that Russia was much more willing to resort to tactical nuclear weapons because it's a weaker side, and therefore more reliant on nuclear weapons. And it's kind of more part of its doctrine. And they have a lot more tactical, that is battlefield, short-range nuclear weapons than the United States does. That said, so far, the sides have deterred themselves. The United States and NATO troops have not gone in to Ukraine physically, except perhaps for small numbers of special forces. And conversely, Russia has been very careful not to target NATO territory, which Joe Biden says he will defend to the last inch. That could easily deteriorate in future. You could see gray zone attacks. You could see nibbling of territory. You have increasing nervousness among European intelligence and defense circles that you could see a challenge to Article 5 of NATO within the 3, 5, 7 year time period. As far as nuclear weapons in space are concerned, again, that was another marmalade dropper. But because it was so strange, nuclear powers have had the ability to detonate nuclear weapons in space since the 1960s. Indeed, the Americans did it and discovered what huge damage it costs to anything in space. So if the Russians were to do that, it would mean that they would destroy not only a large number of American satellites, but a large number of Russian satellites and a large number of Chinese satellites, which will not please a lot of the world, including the Chinese, on whom they're increasingly dependent. So it's always seemed like it's sort of a genuine threat, but one that you couldn't use, which is why people like the Chinese, who are actually now the second greatest space power, have been concentrating on things like lasers and jammers and this strange satellite that was seen grabbing another one in geostationary orbit and towing it out of the way. It's kind of space, Netflix, a Space Force film, that have some of these things where just weird things happen in space, and the Americans are very worried about it. So quite what this special weapon is, nobody is sure. It might possibly be a nuclear-powered weapon rather than a nuclear weapon in space, not least because deploying nuclear weapons in space would be an open contravention of the Outer Space Treaty. So we don't know what it's about, but it does tell us that the Russians are willing to toy with nuclear weapons much more worryingly than the U.S. is.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, this conversation could go on in many different ways, but it's sort of what I think the conversation has highlighted is the debate is shifting from what is happening inside Ukraine, which is still a focus and important and critical to understanding, to starting to begin the process that has already, I think, consumed Europe and is in some ways consuming the debate in the United States about what does this really mean for a much larger set of security issues, and really to highlight that. Can't thank you all three. Journal Catherine Philp of the Times of London, and thank you so much for your insights. Terrific show. Thank you all for tuning in today. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.